today is just get sort of an overview, so that I can guide the conversation Wednesday in the direction that would that you want it to go and that I want it to go. Tell me a little bit about your military background and how you got to Vietnam, and obviously you're a military man all the way, right?
Yep.
You went to the Air Force Academy?
No.
Where'd you go to school?
I didn't.
You didn't? Okay.
I enrolled at the University of Houston.
I see.
Ended up in the Fine Arts Department.
Mm-hmm.
Was in the first TV show that the University of Houston TV department put on.
Yeah.
However, I was not a good student.
Okay.
And had no money.
Right.
And quit school, went back home, went to work for my dad on the Lone Star Gas Company pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, the different military services, Navy, Marines, and Air Force, required a minimum of 2 years of college to get into pilot training.
Right.
And I've already had the desire to fly, wanted to be in the military. I felt that even at that age of 18, 19, what I had experienced in this country made it the greatest place in the world to live. And I thought, okay, it's my turn to give something back. And the way to do it is through the military.
Right.
Lo and behold, a friend of mine walks up to me on the job one day. I'm out in the middle of a field digging a hole in the ground. He says, the Air Force has just lowered their requirements for pilot training to a high school diploma. And I was afraid my dad wasn't going to give me a day off to go take the test, but he did. And we passed the test. We were entered into aviation cadets. Graduated from aviation cadets right here at Bryan Air Force Base. One of 8 out of a class of 550 selected to go with fighters, which is exactly what I wanted to do. And I thought, I'm not one of the top 8 guys, but thank goodness some of the guys with better grades than I had wanted bombers and transports and different things. And because I had the desire for fighters, I was one of the few that were selected to go. And theoretically, we were going to go into the very first supersonic jet fighter, which was the F-84G or F-84F. And by the time we got to that phase of training, something had gone wrong with the airplane and it was grounded. And so went through the straight wing, then went to England Air Force Base, Louisiana, into the swept wing. Wanted to be overseas, so a friend of mine and I both, as soon as we got there, volunteered for reassignment overseas. And 3 months later, we were shipped out to England. Flew the F-84F and the F-100 on that tour. Came back to the States to a GCI squadron, radar controller. Served in that capacity for 3 years, both in the manual system and the automated system, and went to Kansas City, Missouri to fly F-102 interceptors.
Mm-hmm.
From there to Loring, Maine to fly F-106 interceptors. And it was during that tour that I put in a volunteer statement for Vietnam, with a stipulation that it be in single engine, single seat fighters. And I waited and I waited, and I would call personnel, and nothing was happening, no vacancies. Finally, I told my guys to just get me an assignment, as long as it's in the fighters. And about 2 days later, I had an F-4 assignment, and went to school on the F-4 for 6 months. And from there to the Philippines, where we went through jungle survival school. We were due to get on a transport and head on over to Southeast Asia in about 4 or 5 days, maybe a week after we'd completed our training. And that wasn't quite quick enough for me, so I hitchhiked a ride and went on over. Spent one night in Bangkok waiting for an airplane to go up country. And the next day, jumped on a C-130, and we made quite a few stops at little jungle outposts. We'd land, and they'd start rolling stuff off the back of the airplane while we were taxiing down the little taxi strip to get back to the takeoff position.
Right.
Never even slow down, not stop, just shove it out the back and close the door, and away we'd go to the next place. And eventually we got to Yuban, which is where I was assigned.
Right.
Met the wing commander, Robin Knowles, the second day I was there. Took about 2 days to read everything you were supposed to read, the operations order for Rolling Thunder, all the rules of engagement, what you can do, what you can't do, and away we went.
Then March 10th, this was a mission that involved what? The bombing of steel manufacturing?
The Thanh Nguyen, as Americans say, Thanh Nguyen, steel mill, the only steel mill in North Vietnam. And they really did not want to lose that target. That was vital to them. Early on, the reconnaissance showed that there were about 185 guns within a 5-mile circle radius of the target, and that was pretty formidable right there. But the weather was preventing us from hitting the target. We'd form up the strike force and go, but either prior to entering North Vietnam, we'd get a weather report that it was totally socked in and we couldn't get there. And the mission commander would say, okay, everybody go to your secondary targets. So the entire strike force would split up, and people would go bomb their secondary targets and go home. Every other day, it looked like the weather was, although marginal, that it would be good enough. And so we would head for the target, same route, and somewhere between the initial point, which is where you start your bomb run, and the target, the mission commander would say, okay, the weather's bad, we're just going to fly straight on through. And of course the guys on the ground are sitting down there warming up, with their guns and shooting at us through the clouds. They had some radar controlled guns, majority were visually sighted, but nonetheless the North Vietnamese knew that we were intent on striking this target, and so they started bringing in more defenses. And to make the story a little shorter, over the next 9 days between March the 1st and March the 9th, it went from 185 guns to right at 1,000 guns.
Wow.
Within 5 miles of the target. And they also brought in 3 mobile surface-to-air missile sites. And so it was as well defended as anything up there, including the city of Hanoi.
So it really was a valuable target.
They had, I think if I remember correctly, 4,200 anti-aircraft weapons. And so they elected to put 25% of them at that one target to keep us from striking it.
Yeah.
March the 10th, the weather did give us a break, and we were able to hit it.
But things went a little bit abnormal then.
They were abnormal every day.
Sure.
We lost at least one airplane a day.
Right.
On the preparatory missions going in there. But on that day, the F-4 played a dual role. It could be MiGCAP, which is combat air patrol, and all you carried was missiles. You carried 8 missiles and protected the strike force from the MiG fighters. It could be pure strike, which means you take 4 of the missiles off and hang bombs, and so now you're a bomber.
Right.
And then it had the dual role of strike cap, where you carried iron bombs and missiles, and if attacked by MiGs, you jettisoned the bombs and fought the MiGs. And you would be integrated right into the strike force. And the way we would do it, we had 2 flights of F-4s embedded in the strike force. The first flight directly behind the mission leader. The other flight, tail end Charlie. And I always got tail end Charlie. And that's where I was that day. I was the number 2 man in the flight. Earl Amon was number 4. And he got hit the first time over the initial point, which was about 40 miles north of the target. And he could very easily have left right there. He could have told the flight leader he was hit and he was going to the tanker and going home. But he didn't. He elected to, his airplane was flying okay. Most of the warning lights had gone out after the hit. Bye. And be careful now, don't hit Tom's car when you back out of there.
Oh, not in the booth?
No.
Okay.
I think she can make it okay.
Okay. I'll see you Wednesday.
Okay, thank you.
So he and his backseater talked it over and decided they'd continue the mission. And to tell you how cool those guys were, they took turns flying the airplane while the other one prayed.
Wow.
And at any rate, as we continued on into the target, the 600-gallon centerline tank on my airplane wouldn't jettison. When the external tanks ran dry, we would jettison them to reduce drag and get better fuel consumption and so forth. And my 600-gallon tank wouldn't jettison, which means I had to carry a little extra power on the airplane to be able to stay in formation because the bombs were high drag. It created a lot of drag, and so I was having to carry a little bit of extra power, using a little bit more fuel, and there was another point right there that I wanted to make, but it's apparently not that significant. But when we got to the target, we had been gradually forced down because of the clouds. Now, you wanted to stay in visual conditions to avoid mid-air collisions and so forth, even though the flights are separated by approximately 1 minute or 7 miles under normal circumstances. Once you pass the initial point, you don't cruise at 420 knots anymore. You pump it up to at least 480. Well, we had been doing that for 9 days and been shot at so much that the faster you went, the safer you were. And on this particular day, I think the 105s were going probably cruising at about 600 knots. And our flight had pushed up the power to stay with them, and we were doing 630, and I could put the airplane in afterburner and it wouldn't even accelerate. That's simply as fast as it was going to go. So we came back out of afterburner and we're just sitting there cruising, and like I say, the weather had forced us down to about 8,000 feet, and of course that's not good because the lower you go, the more accurate the guns become. The smaller calibers, the 35s and 57s, and they get real accurate when you're down there 8,000 feet or so.
Right.
Our normal roll-in altitude was 14,000 feet. And so approaching the target, we started climbing up. and we were offset to the left of the target, so we're making a right-hand roll in. And just as we're coming over the top on the roll in, Earl Amon got hit again. He says, well, we're directly over the target. There's no sense leaving now. We're going to drop the bombs. And so down we go, all four of us, drop our bombs and pull off target. And during the pullout, Steve and I got hit. Well, the first thing off target, as soon as you are headed outbound, we go to a different radio frequency, an outbound radio frequency, to stay off the strike frequency to reduce the confusion. So we go to outbound freak, and flight leader calls for a fuel check. And it's the same routine every time off target. Fuel check, battle damage check. Well, he called for the fuel check, and the leader was on schedule, 7,000 pounds of fuel remaining, which is what we were scheduled to have over the target to make it home without refueling. 5,000 pounds minimum to make it to the tanker. So I checked in. I was short 2,000 pounds of gas. Number 3 checks in. He's on schedule with 7,000 pounds. Earl Amon checks in. He's 5,000 pounds short. He's only got 2,000 pounds left. That's not enough gas to get him out of North Vietnam, much less make the tanker.
How much have you got?
I've got 5,000. We assumed that a portion of that was because of the hit we took.
Right.
Because what little extra power I had to use because of the tank wouldn't have put me 2,000 pounds short.
Right.
At any rate, Earl was having trouble maintaining formation because he was very concerned about his airplane at this point. We stayed down at our normal egress altitude, which was about 12,000 feet, until we got to the Red River. And once you passed the Red, things started to basically improve. There were fewer guns, no missile sites in the direction we were going. And
It still wasn't the place you wanted to eject.
oh no! If at that point, if you ejected, there were 2 possibilities. If you were captured by the civilians, you were killed.
Right.
If you were captured by militia or active duty military, you were going to jail.
You're POW.
Yeah.
Right.
And so neither of those are very good options.
No.
And so as we passed Red, Earl started climbing. And of course what he wanted to do was get just about as high as he could get, so that when it did flame out, he could glide as far as possible.
Right.
Whereas if he were down low when it quit, you can glide anywhere.
Sure.
So while we're climbing out, I'm looking at his airplane over. Of course, one of the mistakes that was made is that the flight leader didn't call for a battle damage check, or he would have discovered that both of us had been hit and needed cover, for one thing, and could have used someone with us for moral support, but that's neither here nor there. Once they did find out we were in trouble, which they ascertained by listening to our conversation between
Right.
number 2 and number 4, and then their main objective was to get to the tanker and get their gas so they could come back and cover us when we went down. Because subsequent fuel checks between myself and Earl Amon showed that we weren't going to make it out of there either, that we were going to run out of gas before we could get to the tanker. And so my attitude was very, very straightforward. If this airplane's dead, I'm going to get something else out of it before it gets buried. And I started looking over the Earl's airplane, which was flying perfectly normal, trying to figure out if there was anything I could do. And it dawned on me that if he would jettison the drag chute, perhaps I could put the pointy end of the radome right in the drag chute compartment and give him a push. And we attempted that, but when we got within about 4 feet of the airplane, the turbulence, the wash coming off the upper surfaces of the wings and the tail were just too much, and
risking crashing into each other.
We couldn't do it. We couldn't keep the wings level or anything.
Right.
So we backed away from him and said, okay, it's not going to work up on top. Let's see what's underneath. And we went down underneath his airplane and thought, okay, maybe we can get in there and just ease the top of our fuselage up against the belly of his airplane and support him that way. And we'll just push the power up and maintain 250 knots and whatever descent that gives us. When we run out of gas, we jump out. And we would get within about a foot of his airplane, and we could feel a vacuum trying to pull us together. And I thought, well, I don't want to smash into the bottom of his airplane and possibly jam the canopies, because we're going to have to punch out of this thing here very soon.
Sure.
So we backed out from under him and we're looking him over, and I saw the tail hook. I said, well, it comes down about a 45, 50 degree angle. It's 5.5, 6 feet long. It'll stick down below the airplane quite a bit. That might get out of the wash. And about that time, he was down to 200 pounds of fuel, which is maybe a minute. And I said, just go ahead and shut the engines down and get rid of the jet wash. And sure enough, when he shut the engines down, there was no wash coming out of the engines.
He's a glider.
And he's a glider. And we eased in, put the tail hook right in the center of our windshield, which is the only flat place on the front of the airplane.
So he put the tail hook down first, then he shut off the engines.
Yeah. And because when we were trying to,
this crazy thing you were about to try, right?
I think he thought, well, in fact, later he said he thought I was crazy.
Yeah.
But we were able to get the windshield up against the hook and very gently ease the power up, and where he had a glide rate of 3,000 feet a minute, we were able to reduce that to 1,500 feet a minute, effectively doubling the glide distance. And it all worked out later mathematically, because we calculated the airplane would have glided about 46 miles from the altitude where he started this thing. And we actually got him about 88, but almost double. But we encountered a little problem. We could only maintain contact for about 30 seconds at a time.
Right.
The tail hook is held down hydraulically, but it is allowed to swivel from side to side, so that if you're landing in a crosswind and going to take the cable, you can land into the wind, and as soon as you take the cable, the airplane weather vanes right straight down the runway.
Mm-hmm.
So the swiveling action of the hook allowed it to slip off to the sides.
Right.
There's just no way I could keep it perfectly aligned all the time. But we had done this.
Is the tail hook is a hook? It doesn't really have a slot in it. I mean, it's a rounded, I guess.
Well, it's the part that hits the carrier deck or the runway is flat.
Okay.
And it's got a groove cut in the front side of it that fits the cable.
I see. Oh, okay. Okay, yeah, sure.
But on the back, it has no particular shape to it.
Right.
That has any function. And so with a hook down, the flat portion was it didn't really fit the windshield per se.
And what does your windshield look like? Is there metal involved? Is there like a metal bar in the middle or something? Or is it right up against the glass?
It was right.
Okay.
Windshield.
My goodness.
Try that on for size.
So it's an inch thick, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you weren't
This is right here.
terribly concerned. So this is the windshield. So
That is an actual windshield out of the
So you're looking straight out of the middle. So what you're seeing is this with a big tail hook right in your face, right?
Yeah, and your view would be like this. You're sitting back here.
Okay, right. So you're
the
seeing
hook
the tail
is right
hook.
there.
You're right there, and your tail hook is right there.
Yeah.
So you're not terribly concerned that it's.
Well,
Again, obviously, with it.
We were definitely concerned because the F4, an empty F4
Yeah.
weighs 30,000 pounds. So that's a lot of pressure
Yeah. Even if the glass
to
can't
be on a piece of glass.
Wow. Okay.
but now, we did this several times. We did start to see cracks in the windshield,
Right.
and then we obviously became quite concerned. At the base of the windshield is a small piece of metal where hot air comes out over the windshield for ice removal or rain removal.
Right.
And although we were trying to stay as far below the airplane as we could, we found that if we were going to continue, it was going to be necessary for us to move up so that the hook went further down onto that little metal area. And that's what we did.
Right.
And thank goodness it was, it did not increase the amount of wash or turbulence coming off his airplane to any great degree.
Right.
About 10 minutes into this, our left engine caught fire. So we had to shut it down.
So you're down to one engine.
Now we're down to one engine. And of course, with one engine, the engine's being a little bit offset. That creates what we call a yaw. In other words, the airplane turns sideways just a little bit. Now you can counteract that with rudder and keep the airplane going straight. But it really increased the difficulty of what we were trying to do. And so I told Steve, I said, I'm going to go ahead and crank it back up and see if it holds together. So I restarted the left engine, and it lasted about 2 minutes, and it caught fire again. And so I said, we can't take a chance on blowing this thing up. I'm going to shut it down and leave it. So we shut down the left engine again, continued to push with one engine. So now instead of having a rate of descent of about 1,500 feet a minute, we're back up to about 2,000 feet a minute. And we just kept going. And we got down to about 6,000 feet, and I said, that's the lowest we're going, and you guys need to get out of there.
Right.
And so we watched Earl and Bob Houghton eject, saw both parachutes open, knew they were alive and well, and we only had about 300 pounds of gas left at that time. We knew where a special forces camp was that we thought was within about 20 miles of us. And we turned and headed that direction, but we never got there. We ran out of gas and ejected. And now we're all four in the jungle, but all four alive and out of North Vietnam. We made it about, I don't know, 30 or 40 miles into the jungle.
Jolly Greens rescue you? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah. And rescued him also.
Mm-hmm. It was kind of comical. The flight leaders ginned up to rescue and so forth. And the Jolly Greens are escorted by what we call Sandys, the A1E Sky Raider.
Right.
Well, of course, one of the Sky Raiders races on ahead in some instances, and this was one of those, to locate the guys on the ground so that he can relay specific information to the helicopter so there's no wasted motion. And also to perform the identification process to be sure that the guys on the ground are really who they say they are instead of English-speaking North Vietnamese with captured radios.
Right.
Because they did, in fact, several times sucker us in until we caught on to what they were doing. They were stealing or getting radios from air crews that had been shot down and so forth. And so then, when they had a shoot down, they would rush their guys in there and start making radio calls, pretending to be the downed crew. And when the helicopters and the Sky Raiders get in, they'd come in, well, they'd be waiting on them.
Right.
But at any rate, the Sky Raider, the Sandys were on scene. And I told this guy, I said, the other guys are closer to you than I am, and I'm okay. I said, I can hear people hollering and shooting down a mountain near the crash site of my airplane. So I said, go ahead and get those other guys first. And sure enough, they picked up Earl and Bob. Well, Earl and Bob had been chased the whole time they were on the ground. Both of them had suffered a compression fracture of the spine. The ejection seat in that airplane was very powerful, and it was almost a certainty that if you had to eject, you were going to have a compression fracture of the spine.
Mm-hmm.
While not particularly dangerous, it was very painful.
Sure.
And so these guys were running around being chased by people and dogs, and they stayed on the run the whole time they were on the ground, which, thank God, was not very long. They were picked up in about 1 hour. I'm still talking to the guys in the air, and I said, okay, my back seater is between where you picked them up and where I am. Get him.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So they picked up my back seater, and then I could hear the helicopter coming towards me. And the next thing you know, I can actually see it. I said, well, tell me when you want me to pop smoke. And I said, well, don't pop any smoke yet. And the helicopter flew right over me, and I said, well, you're directly above me. And they said, well, we're going up country to pick up some gas so we can make it home, so there'll be another helicopter in to get you a little bit later.
Oh, that's what you wanted to hear.
Yeah.
Right.
So, sure enough, about 45 minutes later, after I've sweated off about 10 pounds, here comes another helicopter. And they picked me up, and they too had to head north and pick up some fuel at a little outpost they had, this little spot in the jungle where they had some fuel stashed. Mm-hmm. And we headed north to this little jungle location, and I don't think I'd been in the helicopter 3 minutes, and I heard one of the engines winding down. And I thought, I was really getting excited by this time. And the PJ looked around at me and apparently could tell from my expression that I didn't like the sounds of things. He came over and sat down beside me, and he said, Captain, he said, don't worry. He said, there's nothing wrong with the helicopter. He said, this guy flying's on his first mission, and the instructor with him just gave him a simulated engine failure. So I said, okay, tell him to train some other time.
Right.
But we all...
They didn't know what you'd just been through necessarily. You thought they...
Well, no,
They knew you were
just some guy in the jungle needs a ride home.
right home. You didn't need... You had all the excitement you needed.
I'd had just about enough excitement for one day. But we all ended up getting on one helicopter for the ride home. And, yeah. And the other helicopter immediately went back on station. Rather than take both helicopters out of action just to haul us back to a friendly base was not good. So
Right.
one helicopter took us, and the other helicopter went right back on rescue. So we got to Udorn, and were checked out by the doctors and so forth, and given a little mission whiskey, and then we had to wait for a ride home, which didn't occur until the following day. Next day we jumped on a C-130, went back to Ubon. All of our buddies there were waiting for us, and we got together in the squadron and they wanted to be briefed on what all happened and so forth. And we briefed them, and as soon as the briefing was over, we were drinking champagne again and having fun. And as soon as the briefing was over, well, the commander says, "I'd like to see you four in my office." And
I want you to say it, but I heard in this story, I heard what you didn't know what to think right then, right? Didn't know what they were going to do.
no, I just knew that was bad news. And sure enough, it was. Someone up the chain of command somewhere was very upset. Thought that we should have been able to make the tanker, well, both airplanes. Then it became my airplane should have been able to make the tanker. So 2 or 3 of us were charged with having to recompute the fuel numbers to prove that we could have made the tanker. Well, you can do that all day long, but if you've got fuel flowing out a hole in the airplane, there is no way to calibrate that to tell how far the airplane will go. But my big question was, what difference does it make? The airplane costs $3.5 million, and McDonnell Douglas is making them as fast as they can. So why are we concerned? We went up there 9 days in a row, lost an airplane every day, didn't hit the target, accomplished absolutely nothing, and you're worried about one more airplane? And yeah, I was pretty upset by it.
Sure.
The flight leader, his little extra duty was to inventory all of the assets at the officers club, counting silverware. Really a neat job. It was so petty, it was unbelievable. And I said, "Hey, this is absolutely ridiculous." I had a long talk with a scheduling officer, and I said, "Nobody has told me I'm not allowed to fly. Put me and Steve back on the schedule." And of course, Bob and Earl have been shipped off to the Philippines to the hospital to recover from their back injuries.
Right.
Well, my medical records didn't make it from UDARN back to UBON, indicating that I had 2 cracked vertebrae in my neck from landing. Landed in a pile of rocks and didn't do a very good job of it. So the day after, Steve and I were back on the flying schedule, which got us out of most of that mess. And I said, let those guys argue among themselves. We didn't do anything wrong from my perspective. In addition to our 2 airplanes, 3 other airplanes were shot down that day. 3. We didn't lose just 1 that day. 5 airplanes. The only ones I ever heard from again were the 4 of us. The crews in the other airplanes were never heard from again. One was an F-105 pilot that we heard talking on the radio after he hit the ground, so we know he was alive when he hit the ground. Never heard from him again. So obviously the civilians got him and killed him. The other 2 I don't have any history on. But I like to point out that all 4 of us were only about 1/3 of the way through our tour and produced an additional 400 combat sorties. McDonnell Douglas could build an airplane in 6 months. It takes 24 years to produce a pilot. So I felt there was absolutely nothing wrong with what we did. And I also like to point out that, people ask me, why did you take the risk? I didn't consider it a great deal of risk, for one thing. But the other thing, and more important, is what I think of as personal integrity. Had I come home, if I'd have just ignored him, let him go down, and I had come home and discussed that flight with my dad, I can guarantee you he would have asked, what did you do to help?
And you had a story to tell your dad, though.
There's
Because of the decision you made.
There's just,
Yes,
that would have been totally unacceptable.
certainly. Certainly.
So for respect for my uniform, respect for my parents, there wasn't any way I couldn't.
Right.
I had to.
Right.
That's all there was to it. I was the only one there. There was no one else there to do it.
How did it evolve into what's known as Pardo's push? I mean, how did it evolve from us?
Well, our wing commander had been on R&R.
Right.
He got back, found out what was going on, and said, everybody just knock it off. This is over.
Right.
And we didn't hear another thing about it for quite a while. 22 years later, I was at a squadron reunion down in Albuquerque. And this goes back for the entire history of this particular squadron. So there were a lot of guys from World War II that were there who had been in the squadron previously. An artist, well, there were several artists there, but this one particular artist got together with several of us that were sitting around having a beer, and he said, hey, so from Vietnam, anyone with a good story that doesn't include a MiG fight, because everybody that had a MiG fight wants a picture of it, you know.
Right.
And I said, well, yeah, I've got one I can tell you. I don't know if you'd be interested or not. And he said, well, let's find out.
Mm-hmm.
And so I told him the story, and he said, yep, we want to do a picture of that. And so that's
what's hanging in.
in the living room. And he titled it Pardo's Push.
So it's the artist that gave it the moniker.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like I say, we had not, well, I don't know about Steve, but I didn't even mention it for a year or so after I'd left Vietnam. Just, there was no need to talk about it.
Right.
So I was at a River Rat reunion, which the River Rats are all the guys who flew in the Hanoi and Haiphong area of North Vietnam. We were having a reunion one year, and one of my buddies that actually flew escort for the recce airplane after the mission asked me, he said, what kind of recognition did you and Steve get? And I said, we didn't get any. We didn't want any. And he said, well, that's not right. I said, no, this thing's been asleep for a lot of years now. Let's just leave it alone. And he said, no. He said, that's not right. He said, I'm gonna see if I can't take care of that. He said, I've been John Tower's military assistant in Congress, and I've never asked him for a favor. And it was during the time when John Tower was being investigated
Right.
prior to being assigned Secretary of Defense.
Right.
2 weeks later, I get a phone call from the Pentagon saying that Steve and I have been awarded the Silver Star. And I thought, well, this country is doing way more than is necessary. And but at that point, we said, okay. Very nice ceremony at Shaw Air Force Base. By that time, I'd been retired several years. And Steve was still in. He said, my boss is a 3-star. He's a Vietnam era fighter pilot. And he said, a really good guy. It turned out to be Chuck Horner.
Mm-hmm. Well.
And so General Horner took care of the presentation, had a retreat ceremony. It was very nice.
And where did this happen?
At Shell Air Force Base, South Carolina. And again, we just kind of said, okay, that's that. Maybe it's all over now.
Right.
Never got a bill for an F4. But since then, it's received a lot of recognition in military papers and so forth, magazines. And the next thing you know, start getting invitations to go here, there, and yonder, doing speeches and motivational talks and so forth.
Yeah, I'm gonna sneeze here.
Go ahead.
You won't go. There we go. Okay. And your wife said that both Wings and History Channel Wings, which is on the History Channel, right, has done
No,
stories? Or?
Wings is on a different channel, and we
it is? Okay.
and we don't get it.
Okay.
But we do.
I know where it is.
But
Yeah,
we do
yeah.
see the History Channel.
Discovery Wings is part of the Discovery.
It could be.
Discovery Wings is what
Okay.
it is. Yeah, I
And,
get that. Right. Right. It's part of the Discovery Channel. That's what it is.
I don't. You don't see too many of the interviews I've done. I've done quite a few interviews, but not too many of them show up on the air because the people doing the interviews
Right.
don't like what I tell them.
Uh-huh.
And I'll tell them straight up, we won that war,
Right.
hands down. We won it.
Right.
Yes, we lost 58,000 men and women, but they lost 500,000. 10 or 11 days after we turned the B-52s loose up north, they are the ones who wanted to resume the Paris peace talks. And they agreed to what we wanted. And then once hostilities were over, the negotiators gave it away. Absolutely gave it away.
Yes, sir.
Bargained it away. Nonetheless, we got our most precious asset, our POWs, home.
Right.
And after that, I'm not sure anybody really cared what happened. We do, in fact, care. We care because we didn't achieve the goal that we'd set for ourselves, which was to keep the people of the South free. Because I guarantee you, freedom is the only thing that counts.
Mm-hmm.
Peace means absolutely nothing. It means the absence of violence.
That's right.
The folks in Eastern Europe, 50 years of Cold War, 50 years of peace. Cold War is over. They're all broken. Their countries are in shambles because they weren't free to make their own decisions, to sink or swim on their own. We continue to grow because we're free. That's it.
Absolutely. On Wednesday, somehow we got to tell this story. I don't know what I'm going to ask you because I don't want to be one of those people who don't let you say that we won the war in Vietnam. I want to let you say that. And so I want to, we'll do essentially what we've done here. And it will just be on the TV set, you sitting in a chair, me sitting in a chair, and just talking to each other and you telling your story again. I'm going to be...
Oh, I can tell it a lot shorter.
I'm going to be conscious of the time. Well, even right then, you told it in not too much longer than we'll take. So I don't want you to be conscious of the time. If I have to fast forward, I can do that by leading you a little bit forward. But it's a magnificent story, and I'm just honored to be able to bring it to people. Do you have a picture of this picture, or
Yeah.
you do?
Yeah.
Somebody you can bring?
I'm going to let you have it right now.
Okay. or any other photographs or anything that, I don't need a lot of things, but any type of memorabilia.
Right. You know,